In the spring of 2019, historian Tyler Morrison received a phone call that would change everything. The caller worked for a demolition company preparing to tear down an old building in rural Massachusetts. They had found something unusual in the basement, something that Tyler needed to see immediately. When Tyler arrived at the site 3 days later, he had no idea he was about to uncover one of the most disturbing chapters in American medical history. The building had once been Willowbrook Asylum, a mental health facility that operated from 1913 to 1968. Most of its records were supposed to have been transferred to the state archives decades ago, but this basement told a different story. Behind a false wall, workers had discovered a locked room filled with filing cabinets, journals, and boxes stacked floor to ceiling. On the door, someone had nailed a handwritten sign that read in bold letters, "Do not open." Tyler stood in that dusty basement staring at those 3 words and felt a chill run down his spine. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide this room. Someone had wanted these records to stay buried forever. But why? What could be so terrible that it needed to be locked away and forgotten? Tyler pulled on a pair of gloves, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. The first thing that struck him was the smell. Even after all these years, the room carried the scent of old paper and something else, something medicinal and sour. The filing cabinets were organized by year, starting with 1913 and ending abruptly in 1926. Tyler pulled open the first drawer and began to read. What he found were patient intake forms, treatment logs, and case notes written in meticulous handwriting. Everything seemed normal at first, just standard medical records from a bygone era. But as Tyler dug deeper, he started to notice disturbing patterns. Many patients had been admitted for reasons that would never be considered mental illness today. Women were committed for being too emotional or disobedient. Men were locked away for alcoholism or unemployment. Children as young as 7 years old had files documenting their admission for bedwetting or talking back to teachers. The asylum had become a dumping ground for anyone society found inconvenient or embarrassing. But this was just the beginning of what Tyler would discover. As he moved through the files, Tyler noticed that certain patients had their records marked with a red stamp that read, "Special Program." These files were thicker than the others, filled with detailed daily observations and treatment notes. Tyler pulled one marked with the name Peter Blackwood, admitted in 1914 at the age of 23. Peter had been a factory worker who had suffered a nervous breakdown after witnessing a workplace accident. His family had committed him, expecting he would receive rest and counseling. Instead, Peter became part of something far more sinister. According to the notes, Peter was selected for experimental treatments designed by the asylum's head physician, Dr. Camden Hollis. Dr. Hollis believed that mental illness could be cured through a combination of physical punishment, sensory deprivation, and what he called corrective procedures. Peter's file documented months of horrific abuse disguised as medical treatment. He was placed in isolation for weeks at a time, denied food and water, and subjected to ice baths that lasted for hours. The notes described Peter's deteriorating condition with cold, clinical detachment, as if he were nothing more than a laboratory specimen. Tyler felt sick as he read, but he forced himself to continue. There were dozens of files marked with the red stamp, each one telling a similar story of suffering and cruelty. He found records for a young woman named Amira Hassan, committed in 1915 for hysteria after the death of her infant son. Her treatments included being strapped to a bed for days, force-fed medications that left her unable to speak, and subjected to electric shocks that Dr. Hollis claimed would reset her emotional state. Amira's final entry was dated 6 months after her admission. It simply stated that she had died during a treatment session, with the cause of death listed as heart failure. But Amira's death was not an isolated incident. As Tyler compiled the files, he realized that the mortality rate among patients in the special program was shockingly high. At least 40 patients had died between 1914 and 1920. Yet there were no investigations, no inquiries from families, and no consequences for the staff. It was as if these people had simply ceased to exist, their deaths swept under the rug and forgotten. Tyler wondered how this could have happened. How could so many people die without anyone noticing or caring? The answer lay in a leather-bound journal he found at the bottom of one of the boxes. The journal belonged to Dr. Camden Hollis himself, and it revealed the true nature of his work at Willowbrook. Hollis was not interested in treating mental illness. He was conducting experiments, using patients as test subjects for treatments he hoped would make him famous in medical circles. He wrote about his theories with enthusiasm and pride, describing the patients as opportunities and necessary sacrifices for scientific progress. But there was something else in these pages, something that made Tyler's blood run cold. Hollis was not working alone. The journal mentioned several other doctors and staff members who were part of what Hollis called the committee. These individuals had helped him select patients for the special program, covered up deaths, and falsified records to hide their activities. One name appeared repeatedly throughout the journal: Ember Whitmore, the asylum's administrator. According to Hollis, Ember was the one who ensured that families of deceased patients were told comforting lies, that death certificates were altered, and that troublesome staff members who asked too many questions were quietly dismissed or transferred. Tyler sat back, overwhelmed by what he was reading. This was not just medical malpractice or negligence. This was systematic murder carried out over years, with the full knowledge and cooperation of multiple people in positions of authority. But the story was far from over. As Tyler continued through the journal, he found entries that suggested the experiments had taken an even darker turn in the early 1920s. In 1921, Dr. Hollis began writing about a new patient who he believed would be his greatest success. Her name was Magnolia Reed, and she had been committed at age 16 for what her parents described as disturbing visions and violent outbursts. Hollis was fascinated by Magnolia. He believed she represented a new type of mental illness, one that required an entirely different approach. He began documenting his interactions with her in obsessive detail, filling pages with descriptions of her behavior, her words, and his plans for her treatment. But as Tyler read these entries, he realized that something had gone terribly wrong. Hollis's writing became increasingly erratic and paranoid. He claimed that Magnolia was not responding to treatments the way other patients had. Instead, she seemed to be affecting him. He wrote about nightmares, about hearing her voice in his head, about feeling watched even when he was alone. Other staff members began reporting similar experiences. They heard screaming coming from empty rooms, saw shadows moving in hallways, and felt an overwhelming sense of dread whenever they went near Magnolia's ward. The journal entries from this period were disturbing to read. Hollis seemed to be unraveling mentally, yet he continued his experiments with increasing desperation. He subjected Magnolia to treatments that were even more brutal than those inflicted on other patients, as if he was trying to break her will through sheer force. But nothing worked. According to his notes, Magnolia remained defiant, and the strange occurrences in the asylum only intensified. Staff members began quitting, and those who stayed reported that the building itself felt wrong, as if something dark had taken up residence within its walls. Then, in October 1922, the journal entries stopped. The final entry was dated October 15th, and it was barely legible, written in shaky handwriting that looked nothing like Hollis's earlier precise script. It read, "She knows. She knows everything. She knows what we did to them. She will not let us forget. We tried to stop her, but it is too late. The others are with her now. They are all with her. We cannot keep her locked up anymore. We cannot keep them quiet. I can hear them right now, all of them, screaming. God help us. We should have listened to the warnings. We should have stopped when we had the chance. But we did not. And now we will pay. Do not open this place." Do not let anyone know what we did here." Tyler's hands were shaking as he finished reading. He looked around the room at the hundreds of files, each one representing a life destroyed by greed, cruelty, and unchecked power. But what had happened after that final journal entry? What happened to Dr. Hollis, to Ember Whitmore, to Magnolia Reed, and to the other members of the committee? Tyler needed answers, so he began searching for additional records. In the back of the room, he found a box that had been shoved behind a filing cabinet hidden from view. Inside were newspaper clippings, police reports, and official documents from late 1922. The story they told was shocking. On October 16, 1922, the day after Hollis's final journal entry, Willowbrook Asylum had experienced what officials called a tragic incident. A fire had broken out in the administrative wing in the middle of the night, killing 5 staff members. Among the dead were Dr. Camden Hollis and Ember Whitmore. The police report stated that the fire appeared to have started in multiple locations simultaneously, which suggested arson. However, no arrests were ever made, and the investigation was closed within a week. The official conclusion was that the fire had been started accidentally by a patient, though no specific patient was named. Tyler found this explanation highly suspicious, especially given what he had just read in Hollis's journal. But there was more to the story. According to the documents, after the fire, the asylum had undergone significant changes. The special program was quietly discontinued, and several staff members were dismissed without explanation. A new director was appointed, and new policies were put in place regarding patient treatment. It was as if someone in authority had finally realized what was happening at Willowbrook and had taken steps to end it. But there was one detail that Tyler found particularly chilling. Among the list of patients who had been transferred to other facilities after the fire, there was no mention of Magnolia Reed. Tyler searched through every document in the room, looking for some indication of what had happened to her. Had she died in the fire? Had she been released? Had she been transferred to another asylum? But there was nothing. Magnolia Reed's file ended abruptly in October 1922, with no final entry, no discharge paperwork, and no death certificate. It was as if she had simply vanished. Tyler found this deeply unsettling, but he was about to discover something even more disturbing. At the very bottom of the hidden box, underneath all the newspaper clippings and official documents, Tyler found a sealed envelope. It was addressed to "Whoever finds this room," and was dated October 20th, 1922. Tyler carefully opened the envelope and pulled out a handwritten letter. It was signed by a man named Zachary Thompson, who identified himself as a night watchman at Willowbrook. The letter was his confession, his attempt to tell the truth about what had really happened that October night. According to Zachary, he had been working at the asylum for 2 years and had witnessed the abuse and experiments firsthand. He had wanted to speak up, but fear had kept him silent. He had a family to support, and he knew that the committee had ways of silencing people who asked too many questions. But on the night of October 15th, Zachary had been making his rounds when he heard something that made him stop in his tracks. It was singing, coming from the locked ward where Magnolia Reed was kept. Zachary wrote that he approached the ward with caution, expecting to find staff members conducting one of their late-night treatment sessions. But when he looked through the small window in the door, he saw something that defied explanation. Magnolia was standing in the center of her room, singing softly, and around her were figures. Translucent, barely visible figures that seemed to be made of smoke or shadow. Zachary counted at least a dozen of them, and he recognized some of their faces from patient photographs he had seen around the asylum. They were the dead, the victims of the special program, and they were gathering around Magnolia like soldiers around a general. Zachary wrote that he ran to find Dr. Hollis and Ember Whitmore, thinking they needed to know what was happening. But when he found them in the administrative office, they already knew. They were terrified, arguing about what to do, talking about burning the files and abandoning the asylum before it was too late. But it was already too late. Zachary heard Magnolia's singing grow louder, echoing through the hallways, and then the screaming started. Not from Magnolia, but from everywhere at once, the voices of all those who had suffered and died in that place finally making themselves heard. The fire started moments later. Zachary wrote that he saw doors slamming shut on their own, trapping people inside rooms. He saw figures moving through the smoke, figures that looked like the patients he had seen surrounding Magnolia. He described hearing Ember Whitmore screaming for help, pounding on a locked door that she had entered freely just minutes before. He heard Dr. Hollis calling out, begging for mercy, his voice filled with terror. And through it all, he heard Magnolia singing, her voice clear and steady, like she was conducting an orchestra of vengeance. Zachary managed to escape the fire, but he was forever changed by what he had witnessed. In his letter, he wrote that he believed Magnolia Reed was not insane. He believed she had been gifted or cursed with the ability to see and communicate with the dead, and that Dr. Hollis's brutal experiments had somehow amplified this ability. The spirits of the murdered patients had been drawn to her, and together they had exacted their revenge on those who had tormented them. Zachary ended his letter with a warning. He wrote that he had helped seal this room and nailed the "Do Not Open" sign to the door because he believed some truths were too dangerous to be known. He believed that disturbing these records would disturb the spirits that were still tied to them, and that anyone who opened this room would be inviting something terrible into their lives. Tyler sat in that basement room, holding Zachary's letter, and tried to process everything he had learned. Part of him wanted to dismiss the supernatural elements of the story as the ramblings of a traumatized man. But another part of him could not shake the feeling that there was truth in those words. He thought about the cold chill he had felt when he first entered the room. He thought about the oppressive atmosphere, the sense of being watched. He thought about how quiet the basement had become, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Tyler made a decision. He would document everything he had found and report it to the proper authorities. The victims of Willowbrook Asylum deserved to have their stories told. Their families, or the descendants of their families, deserved to know the truth about what had happened to their loved ones. But Tyler also decided that he would respect Zachary's warning. He would not remove anything from the room. He would not take the files or the journal or the letter. He would photograph them, digitize them, and then reseal the room, leaving everything exactly as he had found it. Over the next week, Tyler worked in that basement, carefully documenting every page, every file, every piece of evidence. He worked alone, despite offers of help from colleagues, because something told him that fewer people should be exposed to this place. As he worked, strange things began to happen. He heard footsteps in empty hallways. He felt sudden drops in temperature. Once, he could have sworn he heard singing, soft and distant, coming from somewhere deep within the building. But Tyler pushed through his fear and finished the job. When Tyler finally left Willowbrook for the last time, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He submitted his findings to the State Historical Society, and his report sparked immediate outrage and calls for further investigation. Families came forward with stories of relatives who had been committed to Willowbrook and had never returned. The state launched an official inquiry into the asylum's practices, and Tyler's discovery became a catalyst for a broader conversation about historical abuses in mental health institutions across the country. But Tyler himself never fully recovered from his time in that basement room. He continued his work as a historian, but he refused to ever return to Willowbrook. In interviews, he would describe the factual elements of his discovery with academic precision, but he would never discuss the supernatural aspects of Zachary's letter or his own experiences in the sealed room. When pressed, he would simply say that some stories have layers that cannot be fully explained or understood, and that the important thing was to honor the victims and ensure their suffering was not forgotten. The building that once housed Willowbrook Asylum was demolished in 2020. The basement room was carefully dismantled and its contents were transferred to a secure archive facility where they remain today, available for research but rarely accessed. The land where the asylum once stood is now an empty field, marked only by a small memorial plaque that lists the names of the known victims of the special program. Local residents say the field has an eerie quality, that even on sunny days it feels colder there, and that sometimes at night you can hear singing carried on the wind. Tyler Morrison's discovery at Willowbrook reminds us that history is not always comfortable or easy to confront. It reminds us that institutions we trust can harbor terrible secrets, and that vulnerable people have often paid the price for society's indifference and cruelty. The story of Magnolia Reed, Peter Blackwood, Amira Hassan, and the dozens of other victims serves as a warning about what happens when power goes unchecked and when we turn away from suffering because it makes us uncomfortable. If you found this story compelling, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into forgotten history and unexplained events. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think really happened at Willowbrook Asylum. Was Zachary Thompson's account of supernatural revenge just the product of a traumatized mind? Or is there something more to the story? And remember this: the horrors we bury do not always stay buried. Sometimes they find a way to be heard, whether we are ready to listen or not. The victims of Willowbrook waited almost a century for their truth to be revealed. How many other sealed rooms are out there, waiting to be opened? How many other stories are still waiting to be told?